Hi, welcome to Virtual CB1A. This is Miss Rena, and for today's video discussion, we are going to have some examples of problems involving trigonometric identities. So we will start with this very simple example. So napakadali lang nito gawin. All we have to do is to simplify cosine squared theta, tangent squared theta. So what is the simplest form of this equation? So using our knowledge about the trigonometric function values, we know that, so as is pa rin to, cosine squared theta times si tangent squared theta, this can be written as sine squared theta over cosine squared theta. Now that we have these two factors, cosine squared theta times sine squared theta over cosine squared theta, take notice that the numerator of the first factor is the same as the denominator of the first factor. So we have cosine squared theta divided by cosine squared theta, sine theta na lang yung matitira. So the simplest form of this statement, cosine squared theta, tangent squared theta, is sine squared theta. Okay? Okay. Moving on to the next example, we have 5 sine squared theta plus 4 cosine squared theta. So let's find a common factor or common element between the two terms. Meron tayong dalawang terms, 5 sine squared theta and 4 cosine squared theta. So how can we make them the same? So for 5, actually may dalawang sagot dito eh. Um, but let's try the first answer from the reference that we are using. So we have 5 sine squared theta plus 4 cosine squared theta. This is equal to 5 sine squared theta pa rin, but we are going to substitute. So remember from our derivation from the last lecture that sine squared theta plus cosine squared theta is equal to 1, right? So if we are looking for the value of cosine squared theta in terms of sine, we can use cosine squared theta is equal to 1 minus sine squared theta. So if we are looking forward to its simplest form, wherein only sine, the trigonometric function value of sine is present, then we would like to substitute cosine squared theta. We would like to substitute 1 minus sine squared theta to cosine squared theta. So dito, magiging 4 times, yung value niya na nandito, 1 minus sine squared theta. Then we will have 5 sine squared theta. And using distributive property of equality, we are going to distribute 4 to both of the terms inside. So we will have 4 minus 4 sine, may squared pala to, sine squared theta. Yan. Now, we have some common elements. We have common terms, itong dalawa. We have to combine them. Let's write down sine squared theta na lang because 5 minus 4 is 1 plus 4. So this is one possible answer if we want to retain the trigonometric function value of sine. But what if we are looking forward to changing this whole statement into a statement where only cosine is present? Wala na si sine. Pwede rin naman na maging sagot yon. So, alternate solution natin, we have 5 sine squared theta plus 4 cosine squared theta. This time, we are going to look for the value of sine squared theta in terms of cosine squared theta. So, sine squared theta from here is equal to 1 minus cosine squared theta. So, our expression here will be 5 times, substitute 1 minus cosine squared theta to sine squared theta. We have 1 minus cosine squared theta plus 4 cosine squared theta. Okay, now let's distribute 5 to both of the terms inside the parentheses. PEMDAS lang tayo. We have 5 minus 5 cosine squared theta plus 4 cosine squared theta. Let's simplify. What are the common terms? We have 5 cosine squared theta and 4 cosine squared theta. So, we are going to have here 5 minus cosine squared theta. So, these are the two possible answers for our problem, or two possible solutions for our problem. One is we have say sine squared theta plus 4, sine na lang yung natitira, and the other is 5 minus cosine squared theta, cosine na lang yung natitira. Either way, parehas naman silang tama. Now, let's prove some identities. We have to prove that tangent theta plus cotangent theta is equal to secant theta, cosecant theta. Pag ganito, na dalawa na yung sides ng equation natin, hindi na tayo basta nagsisimplify, you have to analyze which is simpler. Is it the left-hand side or the right-hand side? Kung sino yung sa tingin nyo mas simple i-solve, yun yung gawin yung focus. It is not necessary that you always change the left-hand side para maging equal siya sa right-hand side. It can be the other way around. Yung right-hand side, ang isi-simplify mo or itra-transform mo para maging equal dun sa left-hand side. So, from the book, we have tangent theta plus cotangent theta. Ito yung pinili niya na i-transform into secant theta, cosecant theta. So, gawa natin ng paraan. Paano natin matatransform si tangent theta to cotangent, tangent theta plus cotangent theta to secant theta, cosecant theta. What do we know about the tangent function? So, the tangent function is equal to sine theta over cosine theta, right? Now, what do we know about cotangent theta? I-add natin, substitute natin yung trigonometric function value ng cotangent theta. We know that this is equal to the reciprocal of the tangent theta, which is cosine theta over sine theta. Now, let's try to add them up. How do we add fractions? So, we multiply the denominator. We have cosine theta, sine theta. And then we cross-multiply the two terms. So, multiply the numerator of the first and the denominator of the second. Sine theta times sine theta, we have sine squared theta. And then, retain lang natin yung operation. Now, let's multiply the denominator of the first and the numerator of the second. We have cosine squared theta. Okay? After this, let's look for the element that we can simplify. What do we know about sine squared theta plus cosine squared theta? From our previous lecture, we found out that sine squared theta plus cosine squared theta is equal to 1. On the book, it is cosine squared theta plus sine squared theta is equal to 1. Parehas lang yan. Kasi ang addition naman ay commutative. Pwede sila magbaligtad. So we know that the numerator is simply 1. And then for the denominator, we have cosine theta, sine theta. What are we going to do next? So do you still remember the operation multiplication among fractions? So if you have 1 over b, multiply mo, 1 over a, multiply mo siya by 1 over b, you will end up with 1 times 1 is 1, a times b is ab. Numerator by numerator, denominator by denominator. We are going to have the reverse of this operation. So, i-reverse naman natin yung multiplication. Magpa-factoring tayo. So, we can break this down into two factors. 1 over cosine theta multiplied by 1 over sine theta. What do we know about 1 over cosine theta? 1 over cosine theta is actually equal to secant theta. Okay? And 1 over sine theta from the earlier lesson that we had is equal to cosecant theta. Okay? Okay. So we have here secant theta, cosecant theta. This is our final answer. Ayan, nagawa na nating equal si tangent theta and si cotangent theta. Lagyan natin siya dito ng check because the two sides of the equation is really equal. So there are some problems that you will be encountering in this subject wherein you have to prove or disprove that the two sides of the equation are equal. So dito, you have to prove that the two equations are equal. Sa ibang parts, so may clue na kayo na talagang equal sila, susundin nyo lang. Sa ibang mga problem, wala kayong idea kung equal ba sila or hindi. You have to figure it out yourselves. Okay, now let's have another one. We have 1 plus cotangent squared theta over secant theta is equal to cosecant theta cotangent theta. Okay. So this time, meron na tayong knowledge about 1 plus cotangent squared theta, right? So that is equal to, hindi ko nababalikan yung dating video. Papakita ko na lang kung saan siya nanggaling. Ba? Nagahang siya. Okay. So, dito siya galing. Dun sa part wherein we multiplied both sides by cosine theta. And then, the other is when we multiplied both sides by the sine theta. So, dito, we have 1 plus cotangent theta over secant theta. 1 plus cotangent squared theta over secant theta is equal to, saan equal si 1 plus cotangent theta? So, ito siya. It is equal to cosecant theta. Ito siya. Yan. Okay? So, para hindi ako lagi nagsusulat, lagay natin yung cheat sheet natin dito. So, we can simply write this as cosecant squared theta over secant theta. Okay? Now, paano natin magagawang cosecant theta, cotangent theta, itong expression na to? So, if you will take notice here, pwede na natin makuha si cosecant theta. How? All we have to do is to factor this out. Kasi dalawa yung cosecant theta natin dito since naka-square siya. We can write it as cosecant theta times ulit natin siya with another cosecant theta. And then for the denominator, we have secant theta. Okay? Now, let's simplify. Ang gagalawin na lang natin itong isang side ng factor natin. So, dito sa kabila, we have CSC theta over secant theta. Ito na lang yung concern natin kasi nakuha na natin si cosecant theta on this side. So how are we going to simplify this one? What do we know about cosecant theta? So cosecant theta is equal to 1 over sine theta, right? And then, gawin kong red para meron tayong maayos na divisor symbol. Secant theta naman is 1 over cosine theta. Okay? So, retain lang tayo, cosecant theta on this one. And then, let's apply the rule in dividing fractions. So, if you have A over B divided by C over D, we change the operation into multiplication, and then we multiply it by the reciprocal of the denominator, which is DC. Ayan, we have AD over BC. So, ganun din dito. We have 1 over sine theta times cosine theta over 1. Let's simplify. Cosecant theta times 1 times cosine theta, we have cosine theta. Sine theta times 1, we have sine theta on the denominator. Okay. So, pinaliit ko lang siya. Simplify na natin. Napakadali na. What do we know about cosine theta over sine theta? It is equal to cotangent theta, or the reciprocal of your tangent. We have cosecant theta, cotangent theta. This is equal to 1 plus cotangent squared theta over secant theta. And again, our solution is true. So, our left-hand side and right-hand side are equal. When we were in college, we denote it using this one. We put a check above the equal sign to denote that the left-hand side is really equal to the right-hand side. If you don't put a check on top of your equal sign, okay lang din naman. Okay, now, let's do this one. We have tangent squared theta plus 2 over 1 plus tangent squared theta. Okay. So, we have here tangent squared theta plus 2 over 1 plus tangent squared theta is equal to 1 plus cosine squared theta. Okay. So, dito, paano yung gagawin natin? Mhm. So, what do we know about... Ay, teka, ba't ko sinulat to? Sa last pa nga pala to. What do we know about tangent squared theta? Ano yung pinakasimple na pwede natin gamitin dito? Okay. So, from our... Tatamad ako magbukas nitong isa. So, dito na lang tayo. Um, cosine squared theta plus sine squared theta is equal to 1, right? If you divide both sides by cosine, cosine squared theta, so magkakaroon tayo ng 1 plus sine squared theta over cosine squared theta is equal to 1 over cosine squared theta, which is equal to 1 plus tangent squared theta, which is equal to reciprocal ng cosine. It is secant. So, secant squared theta. So, meron tayo ditong dalawang tangent squared theta. So, meron tayong dalawang pwedeng gamitin gamitan ng equation na to. So what is the first one? We have tangent squared theta plus 1. Ito po ito, ma'am. E di dagdagan natin ng isa pang 1. Yan. So 1 plus 1, 2. So equal siya dun sa numerator. How about the denominator? So lagay pa rin muna natin dito para sabay na sila mamaya. 1 is equal to tangent squared theta. Now, the portion we're in, isa lang yung 1, tangent squared theta plus 1, yun lang yung isang equivalent sa secant squared theta. Tapos may plus 1 ka dito. Tapos, dito naman sa kabila, we have, for the denominator, secant squared theta ulit. Again, i-reverse natin yung operation ng multiplication among fraction. We have 1 over A, or gawin natin siyang A over B plus C over B. Copy natin yung same na denominator B, and then proceed with addition of the numerator. Dito, common yung denominator natin, secant squared theta. So, i-break down natin siya into 2 na having the same denominator. So, we have secant squared theta over yung denominator natin na secant squared theta ulit. Plus yung 1 over secant squared theta. Okay. What is secant squared theta over secant squared theta? Di 1. And then, what is 1 over secant squared theta? Ang reciprocal ng secant squared theta, ito na siya, oh. 1 over cosine squared theta. So, we have 1. Ay, ano ba yan? Reciprocal niya, we have cosine squared theta. Okay? So, cosine squared theta is equal to 1 over secant squared theta. And secant squared theta is equal to 1 over cosine squared theta. Ito yung principle na pinanggalingan niya. Again, we have proven that the left-hand side and right-hand side are both equal. So, yan! Meron tayong na-prove na maayos. The left-hand side and the right-hand side are both equal. So, hopefully, nakakasunod. Now, let's go to this part. 1 plus sine squared theta over cosine theta. Yan na. We have here 1 plus sine theta over cosine theta. Parang hindi ko siya kita kaagad kung paano isolve. Okay, try natin to. Hindi ko magawan kaagad ng relationship kung paano siya isosolve ng mas mabilis. Kasi puro tayo squared, 'di ba? Wala tayong 1 plus sine theta lang. So, let's try it this way. Di pag mali ako, tapos hindi ko ka-match yung ginawa ng aklat, start tayo ulit from scratch. So, i-reverse ulit natin yung operation ng addition. Pagbukurin ulit natin siya into 2. We have 1 over cosecant theta, 1 over cosine theta, and the other is sine theta over cosine theta. We know that 1 over cosine theta is secant theta, and this is tangent theta, right? Okay, anong gagawin natin dito kasunod? Teka ha, nag-iisip ako. Minus sine. Mm, okay. So, tinignan ko kung paano siya. And my first solution is a bit complicated. So, tinignan ko kung paano siya pinasimple nung book. Okay. So, from here, instead of adjusting our left-hand side alone to make it equal to the right-hand side, ang ginawa niya, they proceeded with the property in fraction wherein A over B is equal to C over D if and only if AD is equal to BC. So, yan, ganyan yung ginawa niya. So, let's try if it'll still be equal after applying this principle, equivalent fractions. We have 1 plus sine theta. Multiply natin siya dito sa denominator of the right-hand side. We have 1 minus sine theta is equal to, dito naman sa kabila, we have cosine theta times cosine theta. FOIL method tayo. 1 times 1. So, distribute natin siya. 1 times 1. 1 times sine squared theta. Sine theta times 1. Sine theta times sine theta. So, 1 times 1, we have 1 pa rin. 1 times negative sine theta, edi minus sine theta. Sine theta times 1 plus sine theta. And then sine theta times negative sine theta minus sine squared theta is equal to cosine theta times cosine theta. We have cosine squared theta. Now, let's combine like terms. Yan. Tanggal na sila because negative sine theta plus sine theta is equal to 0. We will be left with 1 minus sine squared theta. Ang simple pala ng solution nito. Cosine squared theta. So, we already know this from here. Yan. We know that cosine squared theta is equal to 1 minus sine squared theta. So, this one is true. The left-hand side is equal to the right-hand side. But, iba yung naging technique natin. Instead of manipulating one of the sides, we made use of both sides and applied the property of equivalent fractions. Okay? Okay. Ayan, dito na tayo sa last one. So, suppose that A cosine theta is equal to B and C cosine theta is equal to D for some angle and some constants A, B, C, and D. Show that A squared times C squared is equal to B squared, C squared, plus A squared, D squared. Ayan, napakarami niya. So, dito sa left-hand side, ang meron lang tayo ay dalawang letters. A at C lang. A squared and C squared. And then for the right-hand side, merong nadagdag na B and D. And we have values for B and D naman. Ayan. So, let's try to substitute the value for B and D on our equation. So, B squared, we have A cosine theta, tas square natin siya, times C squared, plus, dito sa kabila, we have, ano to, A squared, times, ang D natin ay C sine theta squared. Okay. So, distribute natin, square natin si A cosine theta at saka si C sine theta. We have here A squared cosine squared theta times C squared plus A squared times C squared sine squared theta. Now, i-arrange natin siya. We have, ano to? A squared, C squared, cosine squared theta. At saka, dito sa kabila, we have A squared, C squared, sine squared theta. Okay, now let's factor out the common elements. Ano yung common sa kanila? So, both of them has A squared, C squared, right? Now, if you divide the first term, ito po yung first term. Susulat ko dito sa kabilang side. We have A squared, C squared, cosine squared theta. Kung ilalabas natin, si A squared, C squared, i-divide natin siya by A squared, C squared. Mawawala na si A squared, C squared. Matitira na lang ay si cosine squared theta. So, dito ay cosine squared theta. Paano dun sa kabila? Ganun din. We have A squared, C squared, sine squared theta. Ilabas natin si A squared, C squared. Ano na lang ang matitira? Sine squared na lang. So, dito plus sine squared theta. What do we know about cosine squared plus sine squared theta? Cosine squared theta plus sine squared theta is equal to 1, right? So, substitute natin yung 1 for all of this part. We have A squared, C squared times 1. Anything multiplied by 1 is equal to itself. So, matitira na lang ay A squared, C squared. So, this is true. We succeeded. Equal talaga silang dalawa. So, A squared, C squared is really equal to B squared, C squared plus A squared, D squared. Ayan. In this case, ang minanipulate natin ay si right-hand side, hindi si left-hand side. Okay? Okay. I think this is the last example. Tama? Oo, last example na pala to for trigonometric identities part 1. Ayan. So, thank you for listening. And before we cut this lesson, katulad ng lagi kong ginagawa sa geometry, I want to have an idea on what I will be discussing next. So, tingnan natin kung ano yung susunod na topic. Ayun, sum and difference formulas na pala. Okay? We are going to discuss this next meeting. Thank you very much for listening and see you next time. Bye!